Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to Reading Culture. And today we are going to be looking at a text written by an author you have probably heard of, J.R.R. Tolkien. This work of fantasy involves a fiery dragon and a somewhat humble hero. However, it's probably not the story that you think I'm talking about. Although it is written by J.R.R. Tolkien, it is not The Hobbit, nor indeed is it The Lord of the Rings. It's not even the Silmarillion. Now, the story that we're going to be looking at today is Farmer Giles of Ham, first published in 1949, but originating from oral stories that he told to his children. Now, one of the reasons that this is going to, I think, furnish us with a interesting discussion is that Farmer Giles of Ham has many of the same elements as The Hobbit or even The Lord of the Rings, but of course, it's a very different kind of story. Now, one is rather interesting. We've been exploring in previous videos tales of orality. Well, this is a truly oral tale, but not in the traditional sense, right? In the sense of an oral story between a father and children that is then disseminated more widely to a reading public in written form. It also, of course, is interesting insofar as it is somewhat satirical, right? It's humorous. It's not meant to be taken seriously, and so the way that we conceive of the heroism of the main character in a humorous context, the idea of the satirical hero, um, is going to be worth considering when we look at more serious adventures with dragons later on. So the story of Farmer Giles of Ham probably arose in the late 1920s, right, when Tolkien's children were still young. The original oral version had many interjections in it, even after he first wrote it down. Interjections such as, and then Daddy says, or something like that, and also personal references. So just like we have specific references in any kind of oral work to places and things, right? So in a very specifically oral context, such as a father telling a story to his children, you will have references originally to their garden or their house. But just like in any oral tradition, it evolved over time. Eventually, by the 1930s, the storyteller is no longer daddy, it is now the family jester, whatever that is. And later still, Tolkien orally delivered a version of the story to the Lovelace Society, kind of literary society, and he already by this point is making it more sophisticated. So the story was evolving to be less exclusively for children. The authorial interjections were subsequently lessened, though not altogether eliminated. You still have the author entering into the story at certain points, but it is hardly the epic Lord of the Rings. It's a very different kind of story. And it is also hardly contemporary, right? Is deliberately medieval. And of course, Tolkien was a medievalist, right? He was a professor of Anglo-Saxon studies at the University of Oxford. So as the story became less childish, it also became to be more set in geography, right? There's a sense that it really is set in the real kind of locale around Oxford, though not a fully real one. But it also perhaps became more mocking, right? Originally, it was just a child's story, but as it evolved and he became intent on writing something that adults could also enjoy, and indeed also people of all ages beyond his own family, right? It became more humorous, more deliberately making fun of various kinds of conventions of these kinds of medieval quest stories. The foreword, particularly, is satirical, and we'll look at that more specifically in a moment. And the tale is given a specifically medieval setting, right? There's a lot of references to the Middle Ages throughout the story, but it's not a historical one, to say the least. So just as the illustrations by Pauline Baynes, which should be in most editions, just as they suggest the Middle Ages without actually presenting them realistically, so does the prose of the story. It presents the Middle Ages in many ways, but not in a realistic kind of way. So this creation between author and artist is hardly something that a traditional oral story can possess. Right? But as we're moving out of this oral story that he told to his children to the publishing process and writing it down, it becomes possible to actually have the story be influenced by another creator, in this case an artist, in the creation of the story itself. So by the final publication stage, Tolkien considered it less a story for children than a story that children might find amusing, but is still for adults. It should be noted that the story is wholly separate from Tolkien's mythology of Middle-earth. You might get a few points of connection you could try to make, but it's not in any way set in Middle-earth. So some of the language of the text is obscure, right, as it's moved further from its specifically childish origin, but it's for the most part still accessible for younger readers. But there's a lot of jokes there that only an older person could get. Particularly, there's a lot of jokes pertaining to Latin. So if you know Latin, you'll notice, and I'll point them out when we start reading through it together, that a lot of the words, a lot of the names are jokes if you know what they mean in Latin. And so clearly some of the humor is more sophisticated than in the original children's version. Assumedly he wasn't trying to make jokes to his children about Latin. Who knows, this is Tolkien we're talking about. But certainly as it evolved, right, these kinds of jokes became more prevalent. So in the end, he managed to get it finished. He actually conceived of a sequel, though it turned out it was not to be. And Farmer Giles of Ham, I think, is really enough to get a sense of what Tolkien was capable of doing as a writer when entering into this kind of amusing and not entirely serious world. So let's take a look at the text itself. So one of the things that most editions will probably have, as I noted, is these kinds of illustrations. And so right off the bat, you'll probably notice a very medieval aesthetic in terms of how the text is presented to you. But let's start by just briefly looking at the foreword. So his foreword is deliberately written in language that is kind of mocking or aping scholarly language. So it's written in a playful way to poke fun because he was a scholar, right? He wrote academic papers, and of course read a great many, and was used to hearing them delivered, and so he knew what that style was like. So he's having a bit of fun with that in the foreword. And he's adopting a pose, as you could say, as the author, in that he's pretending that as the author, he's translating a real text that he found, right? So in that way, the author is entering into his own narrative, right? This is something that he'll also do in Lord of the Rings, but he's doing it here, of course, in a very playful, funny way. You also see that he's referring in this foreword to figures like Brutus, who was the mythological founder of Britain. And he's situating the tale, saying it's set even before King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. But he's also making references to places or geographical features like the Thames, which is certainly real. London isn't mentioned, but we do get the idea of a capital that's kind of nearby where that is. We've got references to the Otmoor, which are these stony moors that are, again, real places. Even Farthingo is referenced, or Farthingo rather, on that last part of the forward, and that's also a real place. So right off the bat, we're already getting a sense of where this story is going to be situated. Right? It's a mix of mythology, mythological world, but also real locale with real places. But it's also, again, kind of satirical, right? So it's playing with these kinds of conventions. All right, and we're going to kind of get a sense of the tone right off the very bat. So if we look at the very beginning of the story, we get the introduction to Farmer Giles. And we did his full name, which is Aegidius Enobarbus Julius Agricola de Hamo. Right. So basically, almost all of these names are jokes. One thing worth noting is Giles is actually a traditionally generic name for a farmer in Britain. It has kind of humorous connotations. So right off the bat, we realize we're in a very playful kind of environment. Right. And we get this sense that this is right in days now long ago, when this island, as England, was still happily divided into many kingdoms. So it's before the existence of a unified England. And then we soon get the introduction of giants almost right off the bat, right? We're going to have that are traditional elements in, of course, many societies, including the English and the Welsh. We're going to see here very, very soon the nature of this kind of text insofar as what if Farmer Giles is the hero, what kind of a hero is he? And what do his interactions with the things that he overcomes, what do they look like? So After we've initially been introduced to Farmer Giles, we very quickly get introduced to the giants, who are wreaking all kind of havoc in the area. Uh, and they enter the scene, or at least one enters the scene, wreaking destruction, trampling down crops. Right, even the poor cow gets flattened like a pancake. And here we have this in this scene of the flattening of the cow, we get already a sense of the kind of humor in the story. Right, so the name of the cow is Galatea. Galatea means goddess of milk. So again, it's a very kind of high level joke. You have to know Latin in order to get it. But that's kind of and yet you also get the image of a cow being flattened like a pancake. So this narrative is really functioning on two levels. On the one hand, it's the kind of level of, a flat pancake like cow, which is the kind of thing a child might find funny. On the other hand, you have right, a cow, Galatea, milk goddess, right, which is going to be funny to people who know Latin. So it's a very interesting text for that reason. Of course, we're also introduced in these opening pages to Garm, the dog, who's presented as really quite cowardly, um, who flees at the sight of the dragon, wakes up Farmer Giles. Right, he has to get it on his breeches, right, his short trousers, and go out reluctantly. Right, their very first kind of heroic action, if we want to call it that, of Farmer Giles is clearly a reluctant one to go face the dragon. We're also going to get another introduction of humor here. So we see that he goes to grab his blunderbuss from the wall. And Tolkien writes, some may well ask what a blunderbuss was. Indeed, this very question, it is said, was put to the four wise clerks of Oxenford, and after thought, they replied, a blunderbuss is a short gun with a large bore firing many balls or slugs, and capable of doing execution within a limited range without exact aim, now superseded in civilized countries by other firearms. So there's a really obvious joke there. Of course, we have what you could call an incongruity. In other words, we have a medieval world where clearly even a primitive gun shouldn't exist, right? But the gun is in there. We also have multiple jokes here to the four wise clerks of Oxenford. So first of all, I should note that the definition of blunderbuss is actually from the Oxford English Dictionary. And it seems likely that the four wise clerks of Oxenford is both a joke referring to the four editors, original editors of the Oxford English Dictionary, but also to the wise clerk of, well, the clerk anyway, of Oxenford from Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Right, so here we have a literary reference, right? We have a historical reference. Right, again, Tolkien, and it shows the kind of humor that Tolkien is using, right? It's again, it's highly literary. It deals with words. It's often dealing with scholarship. But it also can just work as a joke in and of itself, right? Because you have a blunderbuss and the situation is just kind of amusing. All right, so right, he is prepared to go out and face the giant with this blunderbuss. Um, but we already are getting a sense of the kind of hero of the story, right? Giles' disposition does not seem exactly like one would expect from a heroic giant slayer, right? It's very clear that he's not looking forward to this, right? He doesn't really want to go about it. And indeed, the actual confrontation, right, he basically accidentally, out of fright, fires off the blunderbuss into the face of the giant. Um, right, who yells out "blast!" Said the giant in the vulgar fashion. I'm stung, right? He thinks he's been stung by some kind of bee. Also vulgar in this case, and of course, not like vulgar as in the vernacular, right? Another joke that we see Tolkien often using, referring to the vulgar tongue, that is to say English rather than Latin. So the giant, thinking he's been stung, flees off into the fens. And again, these fens that are around in the area correspond with real places. Um, so the attack is actually not very effective. Um, Farmer Giles has not actually been particularly brave, but nevertheless, the giant flees off northwest, which is towards Wales, and the village is saved. And he is duly praised by all the townspeople, right? Hooray, they shouted, that will learn him. Master Egidius has given him what for now. He will go home and die, and serve him right and proper. Learn, by the way, using the archaic sense. That'll learn him, that'll teach him. It's kind of colloquial now. We don't usually use it, but that was the original sense. So we have Farmer Giles right at the beginning of the story, hail the hero through really a kind of chance encounter, which is going to be a repeating plot element. We also are about to get, at this point, an introduction to some of the other characters in the story. We're going to see the parson, the miller, and the blacksmith. Now, these are representatives of types of the medieval village. of the tradesmen, of two of the most important, of course, being the miller and the blacksmith, and the parson, right, who is the spiritual caretaker, right, so he would be the priest at the local church. There'd probably be one, there'd be one church generally per village. And again, these are medieval types, but he's playing with them, right? He's having fun with them, getting humor out of them however he can. So, besides being wined and dined by the local townspeople, uh, Farmer Giles' exploits of defeating this giant spread to the king. So we get the first reference here to the Middle Kingdom, which likely is meant to kind of correspond to a real ancient kingdom of Mercia. But of course, uh, it's not being taken particularly seriously, so we don't need to think about it in historical terms. But again, all of these references that Tolkien is making have some kind of foundation in, usually history or literature. And then on the feast day of St. Michael, which is September 29th, you'll notice that using the medieval system, Tolkien would usually use the feast days of Christian saints to kind of indicate the date. Farmer Giles has sent this letter from the king, right? Which is, uh, you know, we have a humble hero, but now we see that the story is raising him up, right? He's being recognized by the king. So he gets this letter that was signed with a red blot, probably because the king couldn't write. If this were a real historical period, that would be accurate. Um, who writes Ego Augustus Bonifacius Ambrosius Aurelianus Antoninus Pius et Magnificus Dux Rex Tyrannus et Basileus Mediterranearium Partium subscribo, right? Which is, it's a very long, right? I Augustus, right? Like Caesar Augustus, right? Boniface, literally good doer, right? Ambrosius Aurelianus, these are real emperors. Antoninus Pius, right? Pius and and Magnificus, Pius and Magnificent, Duke Rex, uh, Tyrannus, tyrant, but not in that sense. And Basileus, another kind of king word of the Mediterranean parts, right here under right. So this is meant to be funny because we have the many names of the king, which are as big and as grand as possible. But of course, when we actually see the king, we'll see that he's actually given to weakness and has very little power, right? So it becomes humorous because it's incongruent. We have this massive imperial title for a very small king. And he not only gives this letter to Farmer Giles, he gives him this sword, which will come in very important later. All right, so let's move to the kind of the next section of the story, the introduction of a more serious threat, or so it would at least seem at the beginning, the dragon. Right, so just like we're going to see dragons later on when we look at, say, Beowulf, right now we are about to see a very different kind of dragon for a very different kind of hero, right, in a very different kind of story, humorous story. So we get this legend of the dragon's tail being a favorite dish of the royal court at Christmas time, probably inspired by the medieval tradition of the boar's head at Christmas in the royal court. There actually is a whole ceremony that used to be for the royal court and is still partially preserved, at least at Queen's College in Oxford, where there's a whole song and dance where the boar's head is brought in. So it's probably inspired by that. We get the story that on St. Nicholas's Day, that's the 6th of December, knights will go out to fetch the dragon's tail, but now they actually just make a pastry. And if you look at the description of the pastry, right, it's very much like a kind of Christmas cake. However, of course, despite the fact that the knights are not really going to want to go out and hunt the dragon is going to be hungry, as it turns out. So we have this scene where we get the introduction to the dragons for the first time. We see that they're hungry for kine, right, hungry for cattle, for cows. And we get a very funny scene, which again is indicative of the tone of the story. So the dragons are sitting around saying, so knights are mythical, said the younger and less experienced dragons. We always thought so. At least they may be getting rare, thought the older and wiser worms as dragons, far and few and no longer to be feared. Right. So we get obviously a very amusing scene where it's the dragon sitting around saying that the knights are mythical, because of course from the dragon's perspective, right, it's the knights who are the myth. So again, we get this kind of satire, right? This playing with the genre in a way that is humorous. We also get the introduction to the main dragon of the story, Chrysophylax Dives. Again, another joke name, which means rich gold keeper. Dives is rich, and Chrysophylax, right, is gold keeper, keeper of gold. and we are told that he has a ancient and noble lineage, though we never learn it. And he is once again going to come into the story in a somewhat similar way to the giant. Garm, once again getting into trouble, runs into the tail, ironically, of the dragon and flees back home, shouting help once again, and awakens his master, Farmer Giles, who is, as one can imagine, none too happy about Garm provoking the dragon, and is not particularly interested in going out to fight him. Right? We get the sense already of the character of Giles indulging in his fame, right, and in his good repute as a result of the giant, even though he knows it was really luck that brought about that situation, right? But now he's possibly going to be forced to prove it, prove that he can live up to his reputation. So he is not happy with Garm, right? Dragon, he says, what do you want to go and find a dragon for at this time of year? And me with my hands full. Where is it? Oh, north over the hills and far away beyond the standing stones and all. Standing stones are actually a real feature near Oxford, right? These ancient stones, mini Stonehenge. Um, so and then we get his response to that. Oh, away there, there are queer folk in those parts, I've heard tell, and aught might happen in their land. Let them get on with it. Don't come wording me with such tales. Get out. Right. So there's this idea already. Again, another bit of humor of this parochial, right, as it's often referred to. This idea of the small town person or the villager person who, for them, anything more than 30 miles away from their village is queer and strange. And particularly, of course, in a world without any kind of form of modern transport, 30 miles, if you don't have a horse, it's a ways to walk. And even if you do have a horse, right, it's not going to go too much further than that. So there is a sense that anything beyond there is strange, right, and not worth worrying about, or worrying about, as Giles says. He doesn't want the dog to come worrying him. So he doesn't want to deal with it, but we also get a sense at this point in the story that the knights don't particularly want to either, right? The knights are set for a tournament on St. John's Day. That's on the 27th of December, right? And they're really far too busy with that to look for a dragon. Besides, they don't want to upset the cook who's already made the pastry version of the dragon's tail. So things are once again naturally going to fall to Farmer Giles, right? Our kind of hapless hero here. So the miller is going to indicate to him that he was sent this red letter and this sword, right, which are virtually indications of knighthood. At least he's going to say so in the moment when he wants Farmer Giles to deal with the situation. Right, even though he had not been dubbed, right, had this sword placed on his shoulder and officially been knighted, the argument is that because he was sent a sword, right, he's almost like a knight, at least to the degree that he should go out and take care of the dragon. So a note about the Miller character, and again, how Tolkien is playing with the medieval types from medieval villages. So Millers were often suspected of not being very honest. So they were often the richest in the village, and they did the measuring for the grain. So the farmers would bring in the grain, and they could be easily suspected of not measuring honestly, right? So he's, in some ways, is kind of the enemy of Giles. Uh, Not to the same degree as the dragon, but to a degree. Right? He's referred to as they're referred to as bosom enemies, right? A joke again on bosom friends. All right, so he's trying to convince Farmer Giles to go out and fight the dragon. Right? We learn that the dragon is near Oakley. Again, that's a real place near Oxford. And Giles is continually making excuses, right? So he's saying that, well, his cowman is sick. That's his cattle herd, right? So he can't go fight the dragon. But he's eventually going to be forced into it. Now, part of the device, I suppose you could say, that leads to the necessity of Giles fighting the dragon is the parson and the sword. So the parson is one of the few people who can read, and he sees that there is writing on the sword. Giles, being mostly illiterate, has not paid them much mind, right? But there are runes on there. Runes are an ancient form of alphabet made for carving, and they were often were considered by the cultures, the Germanic cultures, that use them as having kind of magical properties. So you could carve words of power on a sword that would give it some kind of ability. And in this case, right, we learn that the reason that the sword is so marked is because it is a famous sword, Cadi Mordax, which means, as it says in the story, tail biting, right, or tail biter. belonging to some ancient hero called Bellomarius. Bello coming from the Latin bellare, to fight, right? And the sword will jump out of its sheath if the dragon is within 5 miles. And it, as we'll see, the sword has a will of its own, which is going to help Farmer Giles out significantly. So with the sword jumping out of its sheath, he is going to be forced, right? He's really going to have no choice but to actually venture out and fight the dragon. And of course, he is getting all the encouragement in the world from all of the villagers. It says they all crowded round him, calling him good Egidius, bold Ahenobarbus, great Julius, staunch Agricola, pride of Ham, hero of the countryside. And they spoke of Codimordax, tailbiter, the sword that would not be sheathed, death or victory, the glory of the yeomanry, backbone of the country, and the good of one's fellow men. And until the farmer's head was hopelessly confused. Again, Tolkien having some fun here with actually a lot of, not only with all the names and the epithets, but also with a lot of the language that was actually used in the First World War to try and drum up, patriotic support for the war, including that address to yeoman. So yeoman was someone who held and tilled his own land, but he was not a gentleman, he was not a knight. So there's a sense that that's the kind of place in society that Farmer Giles holds. You also get the introduction of the somewhat morbid blacksmith, right? Who the only enjoyment he ever gets is by predicting awful things, which he does all the time. And again, we get another Latin joke name. So his real name is Fabricius Cunctator, which basically means delaying worker, right? He's an artificer who delays, and he is going to be the one responsible for making armor for Farmer Giles. So he's going to get some chainmail from him. Farmer Giles gets a jerkin, it's like a short leather coat. We get a reference here to what he would like, which is ringmail. But the smith says, right, if it's real ringmail you mean, then you can't have it. It needs the skill of the dwarfs. So we get a reference to dwarfs. They're not going to show up in the story, but we know that dwarfs are, of course, known for their forging skill. But of course, what Farmer Giles really wants is a hauberk. Hauberk is a long coat of mail. But in the end, all he's going to get is it says that they split up some old chains and hammered the links into rings, as fine as skill could contrive. So a bit of a joke insofar as the chainmail is actually being made out of actual chains, which it normally wouldn't do. This then brings the narrative ahead to the festivities of Twelfth Night, which is the 5th of January, on the eve of the Feast of the Epiphany, which is the commemoration of the visit of the three wise men to the stable in Bethlehem. But the festivities are put off, all for the sake of preparing Farmer Giles for his task. We get a kind of famous arming scene, right, where he is putting on his ragtag collection of armor. And again, it's a humorous scene and very much parodying, very much a satire on similar arming scenes that you may have seen in other stories. Probably a good point of comparison here is the medieval tale Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, where there's a famous arming scene there, right? But there's arming scenes in many stories. And just like in those, he's getting all of his stuff on, but of course it's humorous because it's not exactly, well, he's not a knight and he's not really wearing proper armor. And indeed, he notes to the people that, right, he doesn't want to be jingling and dingling like Canterbury bells. Canterbury bells were bells that were worn by pilgrims on their way to Canterbury. Right, he's considerably worried about this possibility of the dragon hearing him. And indeed, we eventually, once he's all geared up and ready to go, we get a reference to exactly what the dragon has been up to. We get a description, in fact, of the destruction. Right? There were broken trees, burned hedges, and blackened grass, and a nasty, uncanny silence. Right? And so it's in this scenery that Farmer Giles heads out to confront the dragon. We note that he is mopping his face with a handkerchief, right, but not using red because that could infuriate the dragon, and a joke on red infuriating bulls, and waiting to stumble upon him at any time. So the confrontation with the dragon is upcoming, but which we'll look at in the next video. But before I close for this video, I want you to already note this far into the story how the way the story is laying itself out, the way the actions of Giles are laying themselves out, are in many ways very, very similar, narrative-wise, to that which you might see in a serious tale. And even possibly a children's tale like The Hobbit, which is nevertheless not comedic like this one is. and think about what is it about the narrative, and particularly the main hero, that actually makes it not a serious dragon quest. There's a lot of answers to that question. But keep it in mind when we, in the next video, consider a bit more fully what kind of a hero is Farmer Giles anyway? Or is he a hero at all?